All right, what's going on?
We're back.
that's the best way to put it. We're back. After a brief hiatus of a couple months, we've decided to roll back in with season 2 of The Cusp. I guess, why do we take the break again, guys? What was the rationale?
We needed, to go into hibernation, take a little bit of a sabbatical, rethink the podcast a bit as well. We really planned a lot of interesting content for the season. So, hoping all of you guys enjoy the new stuff we planned for the season.
Yeah, I think we're a real warm weather podcast. That's what this turning into.
No, I think also just like a lot of life things happened for us. We were busy with work, with exams. I started a new job. I moved out of my parents' house. Just a lot of life changes that we needed to figure out, and so that kind of put the move. Move was good, man. Move was good. It's I don't know. It's a big change to be 100% on my own. I also turned, so I guess to the listeners, I turned 25 recently, which was a big one. Like this one felt big, and it was weird because like I had just gotten a new job, I just got my own apartment, and I turned 25, and I kind of had this feeling of everything that I was working towards I accomplished, and I realized after that, so is this it? Like, is this what it is to be an adult? I had a bit of a quarter life crisis.
Yeah, and I feel like there are a lot of reasons all of us could have been lost in our fields the last couple months. There's a lot of changes, and obviously everyone's been through quite the year. So people in our age demo, we're looking for guidance, and I think that's kind of what we wanted to bring into the beginning of this season. Sorting some of that stuff out.
100%.
What are the troubles of a quarter life crisis 25-year-old?
Compared to other people, I don't know. I think a good way to divide this up would be work, love, and body and mind. I think that's like a really good 3-pronged summary.
Why don't you tell the listeners where you got this magical 3 buckets, Tony?
Yeah, tell the listeners, please.
Well, I recently read this book called the Defining Decade by Dr. Meg Jay. I don't know if either of you have heard of it.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Dr. Meg Jay wrote this book, Defining Decade. I think the first edition was in 2012. So she's a clinical psychologist, and her major area of expertise, as she describes it, is 20-somethings. So everyone, in the 20-year age group, and all of their life journeys, ups and downs. She studies that. She has a practice where she's spoken to 20-somethings for decades now. And she kind of consolidated all of the information she's learned through her sessions and through research as well into the book, The Defining Decade. It's a pretty quick read. I crushed it in like 5 days, I have to say.
And I guess lucky for us, Dr. J was, recently, I guess, March 15th, I think, released a updated version of the book, The Defining Decade, with updated statistics.
A long time ago, right? Things have changed.
Yeah. Like updated statistics, updated case studies, updated chapters. And so,
she
was really looking
TikTok in the book.
Exactly. And so she was really looking to a podcast to promote the book. And luckily, The Cusp was available. So we're really excited to see.
That's a very nice, optimistic way of putting it.
So basically, this author was down to talk to us.
Anyways, we're really excited to say that we got Dr. Meg Jay, who is the author of The Defining Decade and SUPERNORMAL, on the podcast. Dr. Meg was awesome. She was just a phenomenal guest. We really enjoyed our conversation with her. Funny enough, actually, just so the listeners know, she actually asked us to call her Meg, just to keep it casual. Call her Meg. All of our clients call her Meg. And funny enough, we were laughing about this. It almost felt like we were one of her clients, because throughout the interview, she kept asking, "So what do you think? What do you think about this?
Yeah, it felt like we were on the couch of Meg, right? So kind of felt like a bit of a therapy session.
100%, 100%. Well, hey, before we get going, I just wanted to say to our existing listeners, our existing audience, thank you again for tuning in. We're really excited to give you content again. I know some of you have been messaging us like, when's the season coming out? When's the season coming out? Well, it's here, and more content will be coming soon. And I guess to our new listeners, welcome to the Cusp podcast. Do either of you guys want to maybe pitch what the podcast is, what we're talking about?
Like, where have you been? Have you been living under a rock? You haven't heard of the Cusp? Like, come on. Okay, I'm kidding. But no, thanks for joining us, all new listeners. Yeah, we're the Cusp podcast. It's three young millennials and three old Zoomers. We couldn't decide which generation we are part of, so we just considered ourselves on the cusp. And we bring to you social commentary from the lives of three BIPOC individuals going through through the challenges of our generation. So, a lot of interesting topics come from that lens. And I'm really excited about today's episode about the defining decade, because we're all kind of right smack in the middle of it too.
Yeah, we do our best not to sound dumb most of the time. And I think we're partially successful. I would go that far, guys. So, and I think we're going to continue that success in season 2.
Yeah, so get ready for a partially successful podcast.
Yet again.
We'll stop with the self-deprecating humor, but thanks again for listening, and I hope you enjoy the interview.
So I think, we're good to roll, Meg. So I think, why don't we just begin? Meg, could you maybe just, introduce yourself to our audience? Some people might not know who you are, so could you give us a quick intro?
Yeah, my name is Meg Jay. I am a clinical psychologist, and I specialize in, of all things, 20-somethings. And I have a book out called The Defining Decade, which is for and about 20-somethings everywhere.
Perfect. So I think, the first question we wanted to ask is exactly on your book, The Defining Decade. So I believe you wrote the book in sometime in 2012 was when it was first released. And it's almost 11 years since then. Uh-huh. So I guess the first question is, what has changed in the last decade since you read the book? And I know you have a new version. So tell our listeners.
Here it is. Gray cover, same schematic. So what's changed? Obviously, social media has changed. So when the first version of the book came out, there was a chapter in there called My Life Should Look Better on Facebook. That was back when everybody was on Facebook, 100 years ago maybe, but it was a decade ago. And what was interesting is at the time, the Defining Decade was one of the first places where people were talking about some of maybe the mixed feelings that they had about social media because it was so new. There was no data, there were no studies. I mean, there was very little. What there was, I could find. It wasn't much. And so so the book kind of hints at what's coming and sort of what we now know after 10 years of looking at, life on social media and how people are enjoying or not enjoying that. And so I would say the social media part probably spans 3 chapters now, at different points in the book. I've done more with the love section. I included a part on conversations you might want to have with your partner at some point. And we could talk all day about when is it too early and when is it too late. But people wanted more. They had more they wanted to hear about relationships and how to figure out, are my partner and I compatible? And then I add a reader's guide at the end. A lot of people over the years have emailed and said, I want a workbook, I want a reader's guide for my book club or my podcast. So now you have it.
Nice. And I actually really enjoyed, I read the book in June of 2020 and I kept raving about it to the boys. And then I actually really enjoyed the additions that you had this time. Yeah.
Oh, nice. I actually had a really, really good time revising it. And I don't know that I was expecting not to, but I had a blast revising it and getting to add stuff that I wish I'd said or that I didn't know then that I do know now. And so I really like the edition too. So thank you.
Well, that's awesome. Well, why don't we dig into some themes from the book, if that's okay? One of the themes that I really wanted to talk about was this theme of identity capital, or I think the way that you described it was kind of like the personal assets that you can show that describe who you are and what you've accomplished over time. Is that correct?
Yep. Identity capital, I think, is a great concept for 20-somethings. And if you notice, it's the first chapter in the book after the intro, because I know my audience. And I thought, okay, if they only get 25 pages in, I definitely want them to get this piece before they throw it across the room or, put it down and never get back to it. It's a really important piece of information for 20-somethings. And it's really a great way to think about what am I supposed to be doing in my 20s? And that's going out there and doing things that add value to yourself. It's spending your time wisely. It's investing in yourself. You don't have to think about what am I going to be forever? What is this job that I'm going to take that I'm going to have for 40 years and get my gold watch and retire? That just doesn't happen anymore, for better and for worse. So it's really this idea that just go out there and make good use of your time, spend your time wisely, and add value to who you are. And if you keep doing that in your 20s, then that will pay off in your 30s and beyond. And you just have to go one good piece of identity capital at a time.
Right. I think the part that I really was interested about was like you kind of talked about young people balancing between crisis and capital, or otherwise put as like balancing exploration and identity discovery with making commitments in one's life. And the people that balance that well have really strong identities. What I noticed was a lot of the chapter was focused on the harms of too much exploration. So people who don't make commitments in their 20s and spend their 20s maybe underemployed or unemployed. But like in our social networks, I guess we're all fairly ambitious, 20-somethings. We see the opposite problem. Like we see a lot of like box checkers who are all capital generation, no exploration. And I'm wondering if you can kind of characterize some of the harms of following a path like that.
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said in that chapter, the happiest, most successful people, they balance exploration and commitment. So, too much exploration, people sort of don't really, sort of a rolling stone gathers no moss. There's no there. They might have been here, there, and everywhere, but there's no center. And then, like you said, there are a lot of box checkers out there who feel like I need to do this and enjoy my life later. Or I need to do this and worry or think about what I actually might want to do with my life later. And we know that doesn't make people very happy or successful either. It can just lead to a lot of burnout and alienation where people feel like I look great on paper, but I don't feel great inside, or I look great on paper, or I did what my parents wanted, but I don't really feel like my life is for me. So it's really, the sweet spot is that intersection between making commitments and exploring, figuring out, okay, what commitments feel authentic for me.
Okay, well, I guess jumping into that and just hitting that sweet spot of identity capital might feel a little challenging for a lot of our listeners right now. Obviously, we're speaking to you at the tail end of a pandemic. A lot of our listeners might feel a little paralyzed as they try to network or build these connections. What would you recommend those people do if they're at home or if they're just starting to get back into work to kind of build out that robust network?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a lot of people this year I've actually gotten a lot of emails of people saying, oh no, I read your book and I want to do all the stuff, but I can't leave my house. So what do I do? And so I'll tell you what I've told them, which is, not all identity capital, if that's what you want to focus on, not all identity capital comes from the office. And so, some of my clients this year have used the time to kind of take their careers in a different direction by studying something online or finally studying for the grad school exam they'd meant to. Others are doing things that are good for them. I have a client who got sober this year. That was long overdue and is going to help her a lot, both as a person, as a worker. I mean, it's far more important than any particular job she could have had this year. So to just remember that not all identity capital is whatever your last job was, that sometimes there's hobbies that we have or cool things that we learned about, or the fact that we speak a language that most people don't. I mean, it really could be anything. And I think what employers are going to want to know is not necessarily what did the pandemic do to you, or, you know, how did it harm you? They're going to want to know, so what did you do? I mean, how did you get through the year? And they don't expect you to have taken 4 classes online necessarily, but they may be interested in sort of how did you cope? Because that says a lot about kind of what kind of resilience you're going to bring into the workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. No, absolutely. I agree with that, Meg. I think, you know, I speak to some of my friends, they tell me, you know, and they wanted me to ask you this as well, is like, they feel like COVID was a lost year. So I just wonder, like, what's your response to people like that? How can they reframe it?
Yeah, I would say we don't know that. And, you know, I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there, even pre-COVID, I got all kinds of emails over the years of, boy, I had a lost year in Brazil, or boy, I had that lost year when I was waiting tables and should have been doing something else. So, you know, a lot of us have a lost year here and there for different reasons. It doesn't have to be the end of us. And so I think, you know, it's normal that when we're in an uncertain, kind of threatening seeming situation, we imagine the worst. But we don't know that maybe something that happened this year, maybe you started a podcast and dug into it because you could, because of the pandemic, or maybe you listened to a podcast you wouldn't have otherwise, that ended up taking your life in a different direction. Or maybe you went for your 100th walk around your town and had an idea, or moved or met someone that you wouldn't have otherwise. So we don't really know what the outcome of this is going to be. But one thing's for sure, 20-somethings have a lot of recovery time sort of in their lives and their careers. And I think for some people, the pandemic has helped people kind of feel that urgency of, oh man, it's true, my time isn't unlimited. That, you know, they're feeling a bit of that, I got to get out there and get going. And that's probably accurate.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think one thing that I've noticed, at least, is a lot of my friends, you know, there was this article that blew up in The Atlantic about 2 years ago called "The Religion of Workism is Making Us Miserable," right? And a lot of my friends in my network kind of related to it because, you know, basically we spent years trying to get a job and we got this, I guess, burst of happiness when we got this job. But then what we realized was, you know, after we started working, the luster kind of wears off. Like, is this it? Like, is this my life? And I feel like
the new relationship energy is gone.
Bingo, you're out of honeymoon phase, right? And especially during the pandemic.
Right.
And especially during the pandemic, right? Because you're like, you're really out of the honeymoon phase because you're not in like a corporate, you know, fancy office in Manhattan. You're at home in like a cramped apartment. Right. And I guess, could you speak to maybe perhaps in your psychology practice or in your conversations with young people, how you've seen them discover meaning beyond work in an era where, you know, things like religion have lost, like a lot of people have turned away from religion, or a lot of people have turned away from perhaps their local communities. How have they found meaning?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think ultimately most of us want to find meaning. Well, I don't know. Many of us want to find meaning through work, but even if you want that, it often isn't available in your 20s. So I do extremely meaningful work, but I wouldn't say that the training period, I don't know that graduate school felt very meaningful. It felt very grueling and dysfunctional, actually. So I know what you're saying of, even if we're headed toward having some meaning in our lives, you know, maybe our relationships, you know, they're not at the meaningful phases yet. Work isn't at the meaningful phases. It's kind of, how do we figure out what that's going to be for ourselves? And I think that's a really excellent question. And it's almost one of short-term and long-term meaning, that you may feel like, I can see my job being meaningful at some point, maybe when I'm a little bit further along, or my relationships being more meaningful when they're more established, if that's what you want. But kind of how to think about what could I do that feels meaningful now, whether that's being more connected with people or your community or politics or social justice or volunteer work. I mean, but I really hear what you're saying, that I think it's true that when we don't have access to sort of robust long-term sources of meaning, we really have to find ways to get it for ourselves in the now. And that's going to look different for different people. But I think you're right. I've never thought about that way before, but I think it's true.
Mm-hmm. No, that's a good point.
So something you talk about a bit throughout the book is this disparity in how maybe like older people view 20-somethings and the things they find meaning in. So for instance, you gave this example of, I think, like only 10% of 20-somethings are looking to participate in this hookup culture. But that seems to be this pervasive media narrative about 20. So where do you think that comes from? That kind of disparity?
I do not know. I feel like every time I go on a radio show or something that's not hosted by 20-somethings, there's sort of a checklist of questions that I'm asked. And what is, why is everybody taking so long to grow up? And another one is, does everybody just have helicopter parents? I mean, it's just these funny, well, I don't know how funny it is, but there are these narratives out there that everybody's the same, that you've all got helicopter parents, that no one wants to grow up. And I mean, that is a teeny tiny fraction of the 20-somethings I've worked with. And, like you're talking about, a lot of the 20-somethings I know are working really hard to try to get going in life. And a lot of them would have killed to have had a helicopter parent. So, I think what makes for good articles and clickbait in some of the publications that are read by non-Gen Zers or non-millennials or really non-Gen Xers, I'm a Gen Xer, I think is really different than your particular reality. I mean, I know that a lot of stuff that I read, that doesn't resonate with me at all in terms of my actual clients. Well, that's why the Defining Decade book came about, is that there weren't books out there that really took the time period seriously and said, let's talk. I see you. It's a difficult time. It's an important time. But meanwhile, it's being kind of trivialized in the media or criticized. And it's funny, I think when the book was first kind of sold to publishers, one of the people in the publicity department said no 20-something would be caught dead reading this book. And I said, well, I don't know about that. I have a private practice full of them. And so now, it's sold 500,000 copies and it's on the 10-year edition. And so I think there's a real disconnect between the reality of being in your 20s and the way it gets talked about.
How wrong some of those publishers were.
Yes, fortunately for all of us, I guess.
I guess just jumping into your comment that a lot of the 20-somethings, would like kill for a helicopter parent. I think that's something that was, I guess, interesting to a lot of us. A lot of our audience is, in the BIPOC community, and they might feel like they have two very strong helicopter parents, which would be a real contrast to someone who hears phrases like, you can be anything you want to. So I guess, what is your advice to those people who say, hey, my parents want me to go to med school, law school, or maybe be an engineer?
Or an accountant, maybe an accountant, but that's like a tear down.
Or all those things.
Yeah.
or both, right? The MD, PhD, and then that's just in the first 5 years. I mean, I think part of adulthood is claiming your own life. And so whether that means realizing your parents might not have helped you at all, but now it's up to you, or whether that's realizing, geez, my parents have really smothered me, but I got to get out from under, and now it's up to me. I mean, I think adulthood is really about claiming your life from here forward, and, no blame for what people didn't do or for what people did do too much, but to say from here on out, this is me, this is mine. and how do I want to do this? So, I mean, I think the advice, I mean, that's what's interesting about the Defining Decade is it's written for, and from my knowledge, really resonates across a broad spectrum of 20-somethings, because I'm really talking about human development, adult development, and maybe what kind of parents you had is not necessarily maybe as important as we think.
I wanted to pivot a little bit actually into some of the talks in the book about relationships, dating, and love. I love that you had different parts in the book for the different parts of a 20-something's life. And one thing that really stuck out for me was that chapter about cohabitation. Specifically kind of like your argument that, cohabitation is not always a good idea for young people who want to test their relationship before marriage. Could you speak to this idea a little further for our listeners? Because I've read it, I know the context, but I think it's really valuable to dive into.
Yeah. It really is. It's that's why it got its own chapter. And it's really because, in your 20s, you're more likely to live with a partner than get married or, kind of make a lifetime commitment. So it's something we really need to think about. How does cohabitation work? Why do we do it? What are we hoping to get out of it? And so there's been kind of a general myth about cohabitation that it is a good way to test a relationship, and that there's kind of only upsides because you'll move in, no big deal. If things work out, you'll stay together. And if you don't, you break up. So it's kind of like like a risk-free trial is sort of the wrap on cohabitation. But actually, what the research says and what my clients have told me for, it's scary to say 20 years now, is that it's not quite risk-free, that it's not quite all upside. And I'm not against cohabitation, but I want my clients to consider the upsides and the downsides. So the upsides are, of course, cheaper rent, more fun, more access to that person and your plans and whatever. The downsides are, as my clients have told me, is that you get in something with a pretty low bar. It seems easy to sort of, get rid of one set of rent and share a place, and that's lots of fun. But if it doesn't go well, it can be harder to get out than you're anticipating. And so what people will find out is, 6 months in, I knew it wasn't right, or 1 year in, I knew it wasn't right, but it wasn't that easy to get out. And then that 6 months or that 1 year turned into 2 or 3 years. And so I just ask my clients to consider what are the downsides of tangling your life up with somebody. If you're really just doing it for fun, what happens when it's not fun anymore? Or you're doing it to test it out. Well, what happens when they kind of fail the test? How easy will it be for you to get out? I actually just got an email yesterday from somebody who was saying, I'm 22, I've been living with somebody a year and a half, and I'm just, for reasons I won't go into right on your podcast, but she said, I'm just too embarrassed to get out. And from the way she was phrasing her email, it sounded like at 22, she was going to decide to, sort of bite the bullet for the next, 50 years, that she just felt like she couldn't extricate herself. So I try to just help clients think about that, that it's maybe not, it's easier to get into than it is to get out of.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. As you were saying that, I worried about, couples who maybe were at that point of making a critical decision whether they want to continue or not. And then the pandemic hit, and maybe, just due to circumstances of the pandemic, they decided to stay even longer, right? So. Yeah.
Right. And hey, I guess my, people have said that to me, oh no, all these people are moving in together because of the pandemic. Oh, I don't have a problem with that. My question is, if right about now you're not loving it, whether you'll get out. And, when the world opens up, will you say, you know what, this just didn't work out? And I think that's the important part. It's not that you never move in with somebody, but that you pay attention to what you learn. And if what you learn is that you're super compatible, then, sign up for another year or two, or to whatever, point you decide we're going to do this for good. But if what you learn is that the relationship really isn't working for you, then as inconvenient as it is, you've got to get out.
Meg, I have a question on the relationships as well. So, again, one of my friends, a big fan of yours, and when I told her that I'll be speaking to you, she sent me a ton of questions. She said, I have to ask Tom, you have to ask Meg when you talk to her. So one of the questions she had was, she felt that in the book, when you talked about dating, your general advice was kind of, take dating seriously in your 20s, make sure you really think of the long term. And she was struggling to find the balance of, how do I take dating seriously, but also open myself up to maybe somebody with different characteristics that I otherwise may not have given them a chance. How do you really strike that balance? And I know in your book you talk about, there's certain characteristics that should be similar between you and your partner, and there's certain characteristics that maybe you don't have to be exactly the same. Could you maybe walk our listeners through a thought process of how they can really think about those key characteristics?
Yeah, well, you know what? In the updated edition, I actually took that part out and instead have the 29 conversations to have with your partner, because I actually felt like that was really, instead of having it be sort of this mysterious quiz, let's have conversations with ourselves and with our partners. And, I think it's a bit like identity capital, that maybe the sweet spot in dating in your 20s is both exploration and commitment. That part of the beauty of the fact that people tend to settle down later than they used to is that you can use the time before that to really learn something. So if you're just sort of like fun, explore, I'm not really sure how much you're learning after a certain point. But if you, don't explore and don't try to figure out what kind of relationships make you happy or not, you might not be learning much either. So I think it's, for your friend, I think it's both balancing, taking some relationship risks, exploring different types of relationships, maybe people with different backgrounds or of different ages or different, occupations or interests. Like getting outside of your tiny little bubbles can be useful. But again, it's almost like living together. Pay attention to what you're learning. And, if things don't work, it's time to acknowledge that to yourself and, move on and learn what you had to learn and move on to the next thing. So I guess the chapter that's 29 conversations to have with a partner, it's the conversations are to have with a partner, but they're also to have with yourself, so that you think about not like, what does my partner want all the time, but what do I want? What was I thinking about when or whether I might want to have kids? Or what was I thinking about how important travel is to me? And to kind of have those conversations in your mind as you're getting to know people, even before you might be talking to them about that, I think can be useful. That too often we're too concerned about what other people want rather than what we want.
Yeah, well, that's a good point. One thing in the relationship section that I thought was interesting was, you didn't talk about it too deep, but I remember reading it and I was like, I relate to that. And it was like how a lot of young men put off figuring out relationships until they have the quote unquote like work thing figured out, right? And I was laughing because I've had this conversation with so many of my guy friends where it's just like, they're like, what about dating? And I'm like, I'll do it, once I get this job or once I figure this out. Why do you think that is especially prominent with young men in their 20s? Like, what do you think? Is it the desire to be a breadwinner? Is it the economic? Like, what do you think it is?
Well, I'm chuckling. I don't, y'all can see me. I don't know if your listeners will be able to see this, but because of course I'm doing the therapist thing where I'm thinking, why do you think that is? I'm curious about what you say. So, and I'm being sincere here. I do have thoughts, but I'm truly interested in yours or, your co-hosts. Why do you think that is?
I'll take a quick stab if you guys want to go in from there. But like, I think for me, at least, it was like, figuring out what I wanted to do for work with my life was just such a huge question and source of anxiety in university that it became like, let me figure this out. And it almost felt like if I didn't figure this out, I like would have that source of anxiety going into any relationship. And So it almost felt like, this is what I needed to figure out first. But like, as I gotten older and I've like started working, I kind of just realized like, you're never going to fully figure this out. But now that you're maybe on the path, maybe you should start looking at other parts of your life. So that's kind of been my journey. What do you guys think?
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of this might be kind of the social circle. I knew you've come up in, Ankur. Me as well. Like, I think a lot of the people we know that are our age are very career oriented. So I think a lot of the time, other contemporaries our age might say like, hey, I'm more interested in a relationship, but that I feel like that doesn't come up with a lot of the people that you might know or that I might know.
Mm-hmm.
Tom?
Yeah, I think you guys have covered it really. I feel like we grew up with the expectation that as a guy, as a man, that's kind of what you have to bring to the table in a relationship. So if you don't have that sorted, you're not ready. So I feel like there's just that pressure. That's what I think is the big one for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. See, y'all are so smart. You could have written my book. So that is, and you're right. I kind of hint at it. I mention it, but that's what I have always heard is kind of a couple of pieces. One is, and I think this is true also for young women these days as well, of feeling like, okay, work is the first thing. Because I mean, we've got to pay our bills. We got to put food on the table. We're probably not going to have a partner for quite some time. And I've got to, pay my car payment until then. So, I've got to go somewhere all day, every day. So, work tends to come first. And that makes a ton of sense. I think it also helps, like you said, you feel more confident going into relationships. So when people say, what do? You don't feel immediately like, oh no, they asked me that question that makes me anxious and insecure. So you kind of want to get past that point. And I think it makes a lot of sense for men and women. But I think it's really true that, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And I think there's certain ways in which gender roles haven't changed as much as we think they have. No, I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm just saying that is what I hear. That, and I mentioned some of this research in the updated version, that when push comes to shove, couples will say, well, the female is probably more of the primary parent and the male is probably more of the primary breadwinner. And I don't know if that's healthy or unhealthy or right or wrong, but it is still what it is. And I do think that young men feel that pressure more than women, whereas there's somewhere in a lot of women's heads of, well, I want to work, I probably need to work, but maybe I don't. But for men, it's sort of this, I really need to work. And I'm not sure if I want to or not, but I really need to work. And so I think that there's different pressure there. So I agree with you. I also like what you said about how at some point you have to find a way to put, work and love together. And, I think once you get on your feet and feel like, okay, this isn't an all-consuming question anymore, how can I start incorporating other facets into my life? I do think that's healthy and needs to happen. And from what I hear, I think 20-something women wish 20-something men would hurry up and do that a little sooner.
Good to know.
So there's sort of a lot of like, why do I keep hearing that I can't deal with you until I get my career completely sorted? And so, starting to sort is probably important. I don't know if you can completely sort it.
We talked a lot about dating. One of the things that we've noticed with dating, with the proliferation of apps like Tinder, Bumble, Hinge, and like with the rise of online dating, is it seems like there's just a whole bunch of choices, and we have to make choices based off, largely at first superficial considerations. I guess the question that I had was around, how do you, learn to live with the choices you make and be happy with the choices you make when, potentially the grass could be greener on the other side the whole time?
See, now I'm going to do the therapist thing again, and I'm going to ask, because I'm genuinely curious. So what's been your experience of that so far, if you don't mind my asking? So I'm assuming you look around on apps, maybe meet, whatever with different people, but at some point maybe you pick someone at least for a while, or no? And how do you do that?
And you guys want to take a first stab at this?
I think the first thing I'll say is, it's...
Or what you're saying is, no, we don't.
No, I think it's, because you're on these apps, and most times on most of the apps, you get a picture and maybe a few prompts about the person. So you kind of have to make your judgment almost instantly on the spot. Like, is this person going to be a good match for me or not? And I think we're making those choices off very superficial things. We're not really getting to know the person, but you're like swiping left or you're swiping right. So I think that's one part that there's a bit of a, if somebody's profile isn't like 99% there, you just swipe left because it's so easy to get to the next one, and hopefully you can get someone who's even better, right? So I think that's really affected our choices.
Yeah, I think there's also uneven experiences, right? Like, you talk to some 20-somethings and the experiences, I literally have thousands and I can't, it's just too intimidating to pick between. You talk to other 20-somethings and it's like, I don't have barely any options. Nobody matches with me. And then you have the whole, I feel insecure. So I'm not getting matches. And so these apps are actually negatively impacting my senses of security, right? So I think it really just depends, based off how your relationship with the apps is.
Yeah. I mean, I think a new kind of small bit of information that's in the updated version that wasn't in the original is some cool stuff that some of the research from Match, actually, and Helen Fisher, she's a sexual anthropologist. And in both cases, it was sort of their experience, her experience, that, these sites are not dating sites, they're meeting sites, right? You just meet or swipe or not swipe or arrange something or not arrange something. And that then, presumably, in many cases, this will go to a face-to-face situation. And then life will take it from there, much in similar, much how it always has, or certainly has for the past several decades. So I think, some of the I have infinite choices and there's grass is always greener is kind of a mind trick in a way, because that's true as long as you're just on your phone. But then once you actually go meet someone, you do know more than the superficial, and you do know, okay, yeah, I like this person. We're going to do something else here, or I don't like this person and they're not for me. And so I think, once we kind of get to in person, that's how you start to know more than the superficial. And I think that's what helps people say, I don't care if there's other green grass, other places. I really like this person because once I'm in person with this person, I feel like that's all I need. But I don't think it's easy for that to happen on the phone.
So what would you say would make a date stand out? Because this is something we've all talked about in the past where, you're on the app, there's a little bit of paralysis by analysis, but then when you meet the actual person, it's not necessarily just you that feels that way. It might be them as well. They might be looking at the other, green lawns. And so how do you gauge whether, there's this mutual, I guess, spark beyond the superficial characteristics?
Gosh, that's so subjective. And I won't this time ask how you've done it in the past, because y'all are just going to hang up on me if I keep turning the tables around.
We don't mind. It's free chirping.
I mean,
that's nice.
That's such a... I feel like if every time you go on a date with someone, and this becomes a pattern where you're like, there's probably somebody better on my phone out there somewhere. And this, you sort of keep going to, life looks a lot better on my phone than it does in person. You might want to sort of do a little head check there on whether the possibilities are really in touch with like the reality of who you are and who another person is and what it's like to be like a human in, you know, 3 dimensions off of the phone. So, I mean, if you feel like, gosh, I never feel the spark because I always think there's something better on my phone somewhere, then maybe that's something you should take a look at. I think but it's certainly okay to say, gosh, somebody really looked better on the phone than they do in person, and we get together, there's no spark. I mean, that's legit. That happens. But I think, you know, it's asking somebody like, how do you know when the spark there? I mean, that's just something that, I mean, truly evolution and chemistry is sort of, you're wired to sort of be like, hey, this person is sparking something for me and I want to see them again. And that's it. Like, you know, it doesn't have to be a spark of, I think this is the one. It's just more of, do I want to spend another evening, you know, with this person, on this person, and just kind of going one bit at a time. So I guess my shorter answer is you'll know if there's a spark. Although if you feel like you're always feeling more of a spark on a phone than in person, you might kind of maybe losing touch with, you know, like what real people are like, or, you know what I mean? What, you know, the imperfections of real people.
And I guess we'll see all this manifest as the world starts opening back up and people start doing dates in person again. So I wanted to pivot the conversation a bit. So, you know, the book, there was the 3, I guess, main sections. There was the work section, there was the dating and relationship section, and then there was a section about the mind and the body and kind of like some cognitive things that I thought was, you know, really interesting as well. And the specific part I wanted to talk about was, you know, you talked about how, you know, because 20-somethings brain frontal lobes are not completely developed, they're usually more prone to emotional thinking and than logical thinking sometimes. And it manifests where, you know, 20-somethings will be in careers and they'll dwell on negative feedback or mistakes for far longer than older people. And frankly, I really resonated with this. Like, I find whether it's a work mistake or a potential for misunderstanding in my personal life, sometimes I'll blow it out of proportion emotionally, even though my logical self knows like this shouldn't be that big of a concern. Like, you're 20-something, you're going to make mistakes, whether it's professionally or personally. So I guess what I wanted to ask, and you talked about it a little bit in the book, but I'd like to clarify it in the podcast, is what would you recommend to young people to help deal with feelings of inadequacy or a negativity bias?
Yeah, so what you said is, you're absolutely right. You did a good job of describing it. And that's human nature. So negativity bias is, I mean, humans in any uncertain situation are evolved to see the negative, the what if, right? That's how we protect ourselves or get ready for what could go wrong. So it's natural to sort of see the negative. I think the more experience you have around, wow, I thought the worst and then it didn't turn out to be, or I thought my boss was going to fire me, but he didn't, or somebody didn't text me. I thought they were going to break up with me, but they didn't. Just the more you go through that, eventually experience starts to tell your brain, you know, don't believe everything you think, or, you know, fears aren't facts. And that, you know, kind of your emotional brain that's really quick, that's kind of fear-based, is working faster and stronger than the prefrontal cortex, which is that slow your roll. Just because your boss was short with you today doesn't mean you're going to get fired tomorrow. You get better at kind of having that conversation with yourself and moving on. But it takes practice. I mean, it takes literally, I'm sorry to say, thousands of repetitions of, I imagined the worst, or I couldn't stop thinking about something and then didn't turn out to be, before you really learn, like, you know, things will probably be okay. Or even if I get fired, I'll find another job. You know, that if you go through enough breakups and then you realize there's another person out in the world somewhere, then each one doesn't seem as catastrophic.
Yep.
You know, it's fun. This is not quite what you asked, but I was talking about this with somebody the other day. I'll never forget this. My agent, I have another book called Supernormal, which we won't get into it right now, but is an awesome book. And but one person reviewed it quite negatively in the New York Times, and I, you know, told my agent, "Oh, poor me, I gotta, you know, whatever. I got a bad review in the New York Times. She said, well, you're a real author now. You've been shredded in the New York Times. And like, that was it. It was sort of like, done, dust yourself off and move on. There's nothing else to say. And it's funny. I think that's about as much time as I spent on that. I was like, you're right. Forget it. But something so much smaller would have had me wrapped around the axle for days when I was in my 20s. And that's because I had less experience and my emotional brain was still sort of leading the charge.
Right.
Meg, I know you have maybe just about 3 minutes left here with us, so we'll make sure we get you out in time. But I had just a question, actually kind of two questions. But, as I was reading your book, I was thinking, this is such good advice for 20-somethings. It's just nice to hear someone like speaking to you honestly and talking to you honestly. And I wondered, firstly, who spoke to Meg when she was in her 20s and had this kind of honest conversations with her? And if anybody. And secondly, if there's some people who might not be able to get access to therapy or get access to other kind of things like that. So I just wonder, how else can 20-somethings have this conversation and maybe get that kind of counseling or mentorship? So I know it's a kind of a two-parter question, but I just wanted to make sure we cover that.
No, that's a good one. Yeah. I had an undergrad mentor that I think I kind of mentioned so briefly. I had a few that have come up here and there. So for me, a lot of them ended up being professors in undergrad or grad who very rarely, or it was rare for people to sort of step outside of that academic frame and, give me some straight advice about, hey, I thought you were going to go to grad school by now. What are you doing? Or, gee, do you want to have kids? And are you thinking about fitting this in somehow? And I mean, those were questions that people were, it was sort of like, it's just really not my role, or maybe it's not politically correct to kind of ask people things like that. But it was very useful for me when people did sort of force me to figure out what is it you want and how's it all going to fit. And so in a way, that's what a lot of my work with 20-somethings is about. And the whole reason I wrote The Defining Decade is that I saw that, unless you go see a therapist, and frankly, most of them don't specialize in 20-somethings. So most people aren't going to have access, either personally, culturally, financially, or even just geographically to a therapist who really could help them in that area. I mean, that was really why I wrote The Defining Decade, is that I felt like a lot of what I was saying to clients, I was saying over and over again, and that somebody should really put it out there. So if you have a library card or $15, then you can have access to that conversation too. Kind of in a sort of another effort to make that even more true, in the updated edition, there's a reader's guide in the back. I think I mentioned that earlier, because I actually felt like, the people who are emailing me are right, that they wanted to hear more. They wanted to hear more questions of, what do you ask your clients, and what kind of, how are you pushing them, and what are you asking them to ask themselves? So, I mean, that's really what I've tried to do with the book. But, more and more, there are great podcasts like yours where people are talking to each other and getting each other thinking about their lives, and TED Talks. And, that's the nice thing about social media and the internet, is that, now the information's more out there than before.
All right, folks, thank you so much for listening. That's the end of today's episode. I guess first off, we got to give a big shout out to Dr. Meg Jay, or Meg, for coming on the pod and just giving us all this wisdom. Again, the Defining Decade, the book that she's written, is phenomenal. She's been working in the space for years. She's been working with 20-somethings for years. She's clearly passionate about it. And for Tony, Tom, and I, it was just so much fun to be able to speak with her. So big shout out to her and her team again for allowing us to have that conversation. If you enjoyed that conversation, if you're enjoying the podcast, like always, we ask that you please share the podcast with your friends and family, or anyone who would enjoy the pod. We'd love to grow the pod. So yeah, please share it. Also, give us a follow. We're at The Cusp Pod on Instagram, on Twitter. We also have a YouTube channel that we try to upload some certain clips and full episodes to as well, so you can check that out as well. For new listeners, again, welcome to this podcast. We are a podcast that's focused on culture and current events from the lens of our specific generation, kind of on the cusp between millennials and Gen Z. And we have done a whole variety of topics in the past, everything from mental health for men and toxic masculinity to what kind of cities young people want to live in, to the significance of Canada Day and how we feel as people of color living in Canada. So yeah, definitely check out our old episode catalog. And in the meantime, to our existing audience, I know you've all been waiting very patiently. We have a ton of content coming out, including very soon an episode by popular demand, an episode about dating. So we're going to be talking about our non-existent dating lives, and you can listen to us, I guess, discuss our mistakes and reflect on our pain. I guess it sounds dark. No, it's funny. It's a fun conversation. We actually had a lot of blast recording it. So yeah, you can listen to that. And yeah, again, like always, appreciate y'all listening. Everyone, stay healthy, stay safe, and we look forward to talking to you again very soon. Bye-bye now.